Hello, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Deena Epstein, Senior Program Officer responsible for arts grant making at the George Gunn Foundation and a longtime proud member of the City Club. I am honored to introduce our speaker today, my friend and colleague and Executive Director of ArtPlace America, Jamie L. Bennett. ArtPlace, established in 2011, is an outgrowth of work begun by the National Endowment of the Arts to promote the inclusion of arts in community development strategies. The organization represents an innovative public-private partnership of national foundations, financial institutions, and federal agencies working to encourage creative placemaking across America. ArtPlace defines creative placemaking as a set of practices in which arts and cultural organizations and artists work intentionally to help transform a place in order to strengthen social, physical, and economic fabric of communities. To date, ArtPlace has awarded more than $56 million through 189 grants to projects serving 122 communities across our country, including 2 right here in Cleveland. You just heard from them, Northeast Shores Development Corporation's Collinwood Rising and Upcycle St. Clair in the St. Clair Superior neighborhood. Mr. Bennett, who helped define the creative placemaking field when he was Director of Public Affairs and Chief of Staff at the National Endowment for the Arts, became Executive Director of ArtPlace in early 2014 and has brought new energy to its efforts to encourage leaders in the arts, community development, urban planning, and local governments to work together to improve their communities. I think Malcolm Gladwell must have had Mr. Bennett in mind when he wrote his New York Times bestseller, The Tipping Point. Gladwell noted, the success of any kind of social epidemic is heavily dependent on the involvement of people with a particular and rare set of social gifts. He said the spread of ideas requires individuals whom he calls connectors, essentially the social equivalent of a computer network hub, and mavens, people we rely on to connect us with new information. Jamie Bennett is both a connector and a maven. His ability to make deep connections across social, cultural, professional, and economic circles has helped ArtPlace creative placemaking efforts transform communities and neighborhoods across the country. Yesterday, Mr. Bennett spent the day visiting Cleveland neighborhoods and meeting with those who are involved with creative placemaking here. But it was far from his first, or I'm sure his last visit to our city. Jamie is a Clevelander by birth and spent the first 3 years of his life in Slavic Village before his family moved out of state. His grandmother still lives here, as do many aunts, uncles, and cousins. Prior to his work at the National Endowment for the Arts, Mr. Bennett was Chief of Staff at the New York Department of Cultural Affairs, provided strategic counseling to the Agnes Gunn Foundation, and held positions at the Museum of Modern Art and the New York Philharmonic. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Jamie Bennett, Executive Director of ArtPlace America. Mr. Bennett.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Deena, especially. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that it was actually Deena, along with her colleagues at the Gunn Foundation, and especially Dave Abbott, who first taught me what it really meant to do place-based work, what it meant to put down deep roots, stay in a place, and care about all of the people and all of the opportunities and challenges in a place. So I'm in a great debt in the, I think it's now been 17 years that I've been fortunate enough to know the work of the foundation. And thanks also to everyone at the City Club, including Judy Feiniger, who chairs the program committee, in addition to her extraordinary work with the Gordon Square Arts District. And I would just like to say, as something of an outside observer, how thrilling it's been to watch what Dan has done, both in his ability to honor the tradition of the City Club as a citadel of free speech, but also transform it into a 21st century organization. As Deena said to me yesterday, it's not my grandmother's City Club anymore. It is wonderful to be home in Cleveland, and as you heard, I was lucky enough to spend yesterday going around and actually visiting some of the neighborhoods in which we've invested and which I've been following from a little bit of a distance. And you heard from Camille, who went over here somewhere, and you heard from Nicole, and Brian Friedman is also here, and Seth Beatty is here. And what I would ask all of you You theoretically are here because you care about creative placemaking. I would ask that anyone who has not been to St. Clair and anyone who has not been to the Waterloo Arts District to go, because spending 15 minutes in either of those neighborhoods and watching what's going on will do far more to explain creative placemaking to you than I can do in the next 23 minutes. So please raise your hands and just make sure you know the people that you can connect with who will show you those neighborhoods, and that's a very serious thing. So I am here to talk with you about that term creative placemaking, which is the work that we support at ArtPlace America. And I sort of like origin stories ever since reading Superman for the first time. So I'll begin with ArtPlace's origin story, which is that in 2010, the then chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts got together with a colleague who eventually became president of the Ford Foundation, Rocco Landisman and Darren Walker, and they convened the presidents of some of the largest foundations in this country, Bloomberg, Knight, Kresge, Mellon, Rockefeller. And what they really were trying to do was fundamentally change the framework for arts policy in this country. And what they knew, given all of their years of experience, is that the typical arts policy conversation could unfortunately be summarized as give us more money and don't tell us what to do with it. It was organized pretty much solely around increasing the budgets for local arts agencies, state arts councils, and the National Endowment for the Arts. And that beginning is a beginning from a place of scarcity. Arts organizations opened with what they lacked, with what they didn't have. And not surprisingly, that kind of opening is not a wildly successful way to begin a conversation. It also fundamentally ignores what I think everyone in this room knows to be true, which is that arts bring an abundance to the table. And they wanted to flip that equation and open with the abundance rather than the scarcity. And they were very much watching what was happening here in Cleveland, where you all had just passed the cigarette tax in the county to support the arts. And I think partially that was able to happen in large part to the fact that you framed the conversation differently. Here in Cleveland, Tom Shorgel and the Community Partnership for Arts and Culture and many other colleagues weren't talking about what communities could do for the arts. They were talking about what arts could do for the communities. And in the report that I'm sure you all know from Rust Belt to Artist Belt, they talked about things like engaged citizens, youth development, civic vitality, and economic impact. So Darren and Rocco, armed with this knowledge and armed with this framework, suggested to the foundation presidents that they think about adopting a new framework for the arts, one that opened with the benefits that accrue to both individuals and to communities through arts participation. And they offered up that phrase that at that moment in time was beginning to gain currency, creative placemaking. And if there are any urban designers or planners in the audience, you'll recognize that this is just a back formation that refers to the work of Jane Jacobs, Walter White, and that whole school of thinkers from the 60s and 70s. Creative placemaking simply added to the arsenal of interventions those that were artistic. Rocco and Darren and their colleagues were using creative placemaking to refer to the very real ways in which the arts strengthen the social, physical, and economic fabrics of their communities. Now, the phrase was new, but the concept wasn't. In ancient Greece, I was lucky enough to study theater in school, and I knew that in ancient Greece, the theater was not only the literal center of a community, it was also the figurative, social, civic, and religious center. Even earlier in Lascaux, the earliest recorded history we have of civilization is our ancestors who were defining community by literally encircling themselves with the images and the stories of their shared and collective experience. So why did we need a new phrase to describe work that was at least as old as recorded history? Because that phrase fundamentally repositions the arts. It moves them out of the realm of the decorative, the superfluous, the nice to have. Much of philanthropy and most of public policy operates from a problem formulation. There's something wrong in this world that needs to be fixed. A lot of art, on the other hand, operates within an opportunity framework. A chance exists to create some new beauty, some new meaning, some new provocation that had never before existed. And I think this disconnect between problem and opportunity is perhaps why we've historically had that misfit between the arts and public policy that leaves us focused only on budget size, focused only on asking to not be cut any more than we already have been. Before I continue, I want to pause and underscore a point because I think it is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about our work. In creative placemaking, the creative is an input. It's the intervention, it's the activity. It is not necessarily the intended outcome. Our goal is not to make creative places. Instead, our goal is to join all of our partners in a community so that together we can creatively make a place. Creative isn't an adjective, it's an adverb. Those foundation presidents, and the ones who've joined them since, as Deena said, we're now 14 strong, were not just interested in building cultural districts and performing arts centers in isolation. They were interested in building community. And so ArtPlace was born, that collection of foundations, financial institutions, and federal agencies. And what we've realized over the first years of our existence is that the reason we exist is to fundamentally reposition art and culture as a core sector of community planning and development. Our goal is that any time a mayor seats a conversation about the future of her community, we want to make sure that it is housing, transportation, art and culture, public safety, open space, each around the table as an equal, each around the table as a sector that needs planning and investment, and each as a sector with a responsibility to contribute to our community's future. And I actually, as I was preparing these remarks today, I wanted to do that last bit I just did a little differently, and I was outvoted by my colleagues at the office. But I'm here live, so haha. My original line, and I was very proud of this, was that traditional community development has focused on building beds and baths, but it is time for us to demand more. So if you add the arts to community development, it can be bed, bath, and beyond. And yeah, that is the definition of a smattering of applause. So. So at ArtPlace, our job is to talk about arts in the language of community planning and development. But how do we do that? Take foot traffic, for instance, Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Streets. This is one of the most important concepts for any mayor thinking about community revitalization, and very important to council members like Councilmember Reed, who's concerned about public safety. And foot traffic is a natural byproduct of the arts. Performing arts organizations, as you all know, might have 500 people walk into them at 8 o'clock and 500 people walk out of them at 10 o'clock. A museum, on the other hand, might have 500 people walk in and out of it over the course of an 8-hour day. And a set of rehearsal studios or artist studios might have 15 people walking in and out of it every hour over the course of the day. You begin clustering these kinds of arts organizations together, and you can drive 12, 14, 16, in some cases even 18 hours of positive foot traffic, eyes that keep you safe, as well as wallets that need to buy meals, newspapers, and public transit tickets. We also talk about economic development. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is the part of the U.S. Department of Commerce that calculates this country's gross domestic product, or GDP. And last year, they created, for the first time ever, an account to track the unique value add of arts and cultural production to the U.S. economy. And what they found is that in 2011, the most recent year for which data are available, art and cultural production added $504 billion to the U.S. economy, which is 3.2% of GDP. And just to put that in perspective, in case there's anyone here who doesn't closely track BEA satellite accounts, travel and tourism, which is a sector that I think many of us are more familiar with, is 2.8%. So art and culture, 3.2, travel and tourism, 2.8, similarly sized. So foot traffic is good, and economic development is certainly good. But there are many other things that bring those to a community, and some even in greater volume than the arts. Stadiums do it, big box stores do it, for instance. So why also incorporate the arts into community planning and development? Well, the first reason is that art and culture is the one asset that exists in every community. I've certainly seen it in every neighborhood I visited here in Cleveland. I've seen it on your city council, where you've elected a percussionist. I've seen it at the Cleveland Clinic, where the chief administrative officer is a visual artist. So art is everywhere. Not every community has waterfront access. Not every community has strong public transportation. Not every community is anchored by a major hospital or university. But every community has song and story and music and dance. And the arts are not only present, the arts also do something that the other sectors don't do as well. They drive more stable communities. Arts help community members become more attached to the place where they live. It bonds them with one another, and it leads to more active citizens. The Miami-based Knight Foundation partnered with Gallup, the national polling organization, to look into what causes community attachment. Not what makes someone move to a community, but what makes someone call a community home, what causes someone to put down roots. And their top 3 drivers of community attachment: social offerings, openness, and aesthetics. In other words, the arts. But the arts don't only bond people to place, they bond people with one another. They drive social cohesion. 2 different researchers, one at Columbia University and one at Chicago's Field Museum, have discovered that arts maker and arts participant actually function as master identities. Identities that transcend race, socioeconomic status, age, gender, and country of origin. The researcher at Columbia University was looking at aging visual artists in New York City and discovered that older visual artists had larger social networks and more intergenerational contacts than other older New Yorkers. One visual artist recognized something in another visual artist regardless of their age. They could come together and talk about turpentine. In Chicago, Alika Wally looked at drumming circles. And these are groups of largely immigrant Chicagoans who come together from different cultural heritages, and they form durable bonds that lasted beyond them making percussive music together. These bonds were then used by these individuals to help navigate city services and understand what it meant to live, work, and play in Chicago. And what's fascinating to me about Dr. Wally's work is that the others did not have to become more like one another in order to be bonded. They could actually reinforce their cultural differences and in the process become closer. This means that art making is potentially a pathway to an integrated society that doesn't involve assimilation. And I don't know any other sector that can make that claim. Not unexpectedly, when people become invested in a community and when we become more bonded with one another, we also become more active citizens. 2 social scientists at the University of Pennsylvania have shown that high cultural participation correlates with high civic engagement. In other words, those of us who are arts involved are more likely to get involved in civic activities beyond the arts. We vote more, we volunteer at higher rates. Attachment to community, social cohesion, and civic engagement are the ingredients for a stable community. If you're a housing developer, that translates into lower tenant turnover rates. If you're the Rockefeller Foundation, that means greater individual and community resiliency. And if you're a mayor, that means a great foundation on which to plan and develop a community. So the arts do things that other sectors do. They drive foot traffic and lead to economic development. The arts are the one asset that exists in every community. And they bring a unique value add to community development, my beyond. They increase attachment to community, social cohesion, civic engagement, and create more stable communities. So let's take a look at this in action. I was at dinner with a number of members of Cleveland City Council and the mayor's administration last night, and we were talking about some of the transit plans here in Cleveland. And we began discussing a project that we invested in and first saw happen in St. Paul, Minnesota, one that I'll mention was also deployed here in Cleveland in just a minute. The city of St. Paul, for those of you who follow public transportation closely know, recently opened the Green Line, a new light rail that runs along the central corridor and connects thousands of people each day with the existing light rail line in Minnesota. Like most transportation infrastructure projects, St. Paul's Green Line had the potential to be wildly disruptive while it was being built. Residents who have to live next to active construction sites is an inconvenience that is amplified for some by anxiety about massive neighborhood change and potential displacement. Business owners have the same inconvenience of noise and dirt, the same anxiety, but for them it is further compounded as parking disappears, traffic snarls, and any neighborhood media attention focuses on how hard it is to navigate those streets. In traditional community development, residents and business owners would simply suffer through the period of construction in exchange for the benefits to be reaped when the new public transportation system opens. But in St. Paul's case, a coalition came together to make sure that the project was not going to be business as usual. They came together with an organization called Springboard for the Arts and the Twin Cities Local Initiative Support Corporation to create an arts-based intervention that they named Irrigate. This Irrigate project trained 600 local artists in approaching and partnering with local businesses and other community organizations. These artists were then turned loose with the mandate to do something, anything they wanted really, as long as it was along the future Green Line corridor. And over 3 years of construction, these local artists and their small business and community partners produced 150 different events. Everything from a jazz concert at a local Vietnamese restaurant, dance classes in the parking lot of an insurance agency, and a stained glass installation along a chain-link fence. More than one event was happening every week, and the experience of living and working in a neighborhood under construction was fundamentally changed. But something larger was happening as well. Springboard monitored how the neighborhood was being discussed in the media, and it turns out that these locally produced artist projects resulted in some 30 million positive media impressions. This meant that instead of being mentioned within 3 words of traffic jam, the neighborhood was being discussed as a cool place to go on Saturday night. So not only did the residents have the inconvenience of living among construction ameliorated by living in a cool place, not only did business owners find new customers as people from around the Twin Cities came to attend events in the neighborhood, but the city of St. Paul managed to fundamentally change the narrative. They did not spend 3 years teaching people to avoid a neighborhood. They spent 3 years turning it into a destination and creating demand for the very project that was underway. When the Green Line opened this summer, not surprisingly, it was a wild success. People were already in the habit of visiting the neighborhood. They knew it, and they liked coming. Art worked to bring something more to a community development project. It brought that foot traffic we talked about. It brought economic development. It stabilized a community that might have been disruptive. And it did all of that through the creativity that already existed in the neighborhood. And it didn't, as I mentioned, just work in St. Paul. It's worked here in Cleveland. Thanks to Councilmember Mike Polensek and the mayor, the city of Cleveland, as many of you know, has invested in a major streetscape improvement in Collinwood. And Brian and his colleagues at Northeast Shores have also dispatched local artists all along Waterloo during the construction. And I can tell you, we walked it yesterday. It's a cool place to walk and see what's surprising up. There's one artist made a wheels installation, another has done an amazing mural. It's just, there's a locks project along their chain link fence. It's an absolutely fabulous walk that's very fundamentally different than walking next to active construction sites. When I walk along the 2nd Avenue subway in New York City, which has been under construction for 150 years, it doesn't feel as good as walking along Waterloo. So Irrigate was one of the early projects in which ArtPlace was able to invest. And we're looking for more. That's one of the reasons that I'm here in Cleveland. Because yesterday, ArtPlace America announced the availability of more than $10 million that we're looking to invest in projects that can do 4 things. We're looking for projects that can describe a community. And when we say community, we're talking about a group of people related by geography. There are many kinds of communities. There's a community of artists, there's a community of tourists, all of those kinds of things. But we, much like the Gunn Foundation, are looking at a group of people related by geography. And it can be a block, it can be a town, it can be a county. We then want people to be able to articulate a change that that community would like to see, something that community would like to have be different, some problem that needs fixing, some opportunity that needs seizing. We then ask that they propose an arts-based intervention that can help achieve that change. And then we finally ask that groups that are applying to us Be prepared to recognize and define success at the unit of geography that they've laid out. If someone comes in and proposes a project that's going to fix something in Cleveland, you'd better be prepared to talk about how you're going to see that life has changed for 390,000 people. If you can't do that, maybe your project is talking about a block or a neighborhood instead. And the good news about our application is that it's relatively easy. It's about 2 or 3 pages of narrative plus a project budget. And our investments are significant. Last year, our average grant was $330,000. So it's a nice chunk of money to get something done. The less good news is that last year we received 1,300 LOIs, from which we were able to make 55 grants. So just to put that in perspective, Harvard, for its last incoming class, had a 5% acceptance rate. We had a 4% acceptance rate. So in addition to continuing the National Grant Program, over the coming year, we will slowly introduce 3 other lines of business that will also join our work in repositioning art and culture as a core sector of community planning and development. We will introduce 5 community challenges, from which we will select 5 different communities across this country, communities of different sizes and in different regions, and we will invest in them in greater amounts systemically over a long period of time. We'll introduce a field-building strategy through which we'll look to connect the practitioners, organizations, and communities that we are working with their colleagues from around the country. We want to make sure that we can create networks of people who are working in the arts in place-based ways so that they can learn from one another. One of the things that was a big aha moment for me that should not have been surprising is the thing about local place-based work is that it is local and based in a place. And so folks don't necessarily know who's doing it in another community across the state, across the country, or beyond. And finally, we will introduce a research strategy. We will capture the community development outcomes the arts can help achieve, along with the tactics and techniques that help achieve them, alongside those ways of understanding whether they are working. We're going to look at formalizing the what, the how, and the whether. And we're looking for partners in all of this work, and we're looking to learn from and support the people who have been doing this work long before we were created, and more importantly, those who will keep doing it long after we disappear in 2020. So as you all know better than I do, the City Club is fundamentally about the exchange of ideas. So I'm going to end my remarks here, and I think we can begin the transition to the part of the program that I'm actually looking most forward to, the conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
If anybody's looking for the information about the grant program he just referenced, it's been tweeted. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Jamie Bennett. I tweeted at you, actually, Hingetown. Okay, featuring Jamie Bennett, Executive Director of ArtPlace America. We will return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club Q&A period, and we encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. I should also mention, too, that I'm Dan Moulthrop, just for the listening audience. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, which is our primary media partner, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club of Cleveland are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, September 26th, the City Club is pleased to welcome Neil Barsky, Oberlin alum and board member and founder of the Marshall Project, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit news organization dedicated to covering the U.S. criminal justice system. For more information about that program or any of our upcoming programs or any of our past programs, you're invited to visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's program is part of our Arts by Design series, supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. We thank you very much for your support. Our community partners for today's program are the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, Northeast Shores Community Development Corporation, Upcycle St. Clair, and St. Clair Superior Development. We thank you all for your partnership. We also welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Cleveland Museum of Art, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Land Studio, Mocha Cleveland, Northeast Shores Development Corporation, St. Clair Superior Community Development Corporation, and the George Gunn Foundation. Thank you very much for your support. We also welcome students today from Gilmore Academy. Could the students please stand to be recognized? Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. We thank you for your support. And now it's time for the City Club Q&A. We welcome guests from all of you, welcome questions from all of you, including guests. Holding our microphones today are our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and our Marketing and Outreach Specialist, Kirsten Pianka. Do you have our first question, please?
Mr. Bennett, you certainly outlined today the many benefits of the arts in America, culturally, economically, and in so many other ways. I'd like to point out a disturbing thing has happened in recent years. State governments, in an effort to cut deficits and have a balanced budget, have frequently reduced the amount of money which they allocate to school boards, and that's very true in Ohio. And as a result, many school boards have had to reduce the amount of money which are spent on their schools to encourage children to have an appreciation of and enjoy the fine arts. Do you regard that trend as a problem, and do you have any ideas as to how you might respond to that?
Sure, absolutely. So not surprisingly, yes, I regard that as a problem. And it's actually one that I've spent a lot of time working with over my career. Arts education is not something that's central to the work we're doing at ArtPlace, but particularly when I was lucky enough to work with Agnes Gund, she actually founded an organization that was founded in the 1970s to place professional artists in public schools to help replace some of the arts teachers that were being cut by so many of the budget crises that were happening in the 1970s. Since I've been working on those issues, and I should probably pause and say that I'm now speaking very definitively as an individual, not as an executive director, because I got in trouble when I said this in Detroit. I fundamentally don't think that arts education is a problem for the arts community to solve. I think it's a problem for the education community to solve. When I was at the National Endowment for the Arts, we took a look at all 50 states in this country, and every state, including Ohio, has arts standards for arts education and minimum requirements, which means that every governor in this country and every state legislature has guaranteed their public school children an arts education. And as you've so correctly pointed out, in many cases, that's not being delivered. So when I was at the NEA, at the National Endowment for the Arts, we actually were working on a data collection project that looked at how much and what kind of arts education every student was receiving. And our goal was not to make comparisons between states. We weren't interested in knowing whether kids in Texas or kids in Ohio were receiving more theater education. We were interested in comparing states against their own standards. We wanted to know which schools were delivering the minimum arts education requirement to their own students, which were exceeding it and which were not yet meeting it. And those results will be coming out sometime in the next year, 18 months. I'm not sure of the exact timeline of the project, but I think that will actually paint a roadmap for solving the problem. A similar question came up yesterday morning as I was talking with folks, and was it the city or the county here that has done some of that analysis? The city of Cleveland has done some of that analysis already. So the data exists for which public schools are doing that in the city and which are not. And what was interesting is that some of the results were counterintuitive, which is one of the reasons that I think it's important to start with the data. It wasn't necessarily the poorest schools that were receiving the least arts education. It was actually the schools that had the most engaged principals that were receiving the most. And some of those were in wealthy neighborhoods and some of those were in poor neighborhoods. So I think it's a huge issue. It's one that I'm eager to sort of work with others on, but it's one that I really do think we need to make an issue for the national, the state secretaries of education, as well as for local commissioners of education.
Thank you so much for being here today. In this community, we've been having an ongoing dialogue about the role of public sector funding for the arts, an issue I know you've worked with considerably in your career. And I wonder if you could help us broaden our perspective. We often get very focused on the details of the programs that exist locally and where money is going to local organizations, large institutions, and individual artists. And I wonder if you could help us understand the world, the international arena of public sector funding for the arts and where we fit in.
Sure, and it's not surprisingly, it's a complicated story. Because one of the things that happens when people talk about public funding in the United States and want to place it in international context, they compare the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts, which is somewhere around $150 million, depending on what Congress does, with other countries' ministries of education. And that's not a fair comparison because in this country, on the federal level, we actually have a dispersed and distributed model. So you need to look at the NEA, you need to look at the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute of Museum Library Services, the Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center, the National Gallery of Art, all of which are funded separately. And if you add all of them together, this country actually invests in the federal level over $1 billion in arts and culture every year. And one of the statistics I love giving because it's sort of a Rorschach test depending on your reaction, is that the Department of Defense has a budget for military bands that is twice the size of the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts. Now, that's the typical reaction, right? Sort of gasps and wringing of hands. I actually think it's a fabulous statistic because if you want to talk about delivering more music to more Americans more often, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better delivery system than the US military. So I actually think that's a great investment and would love to catch the NEA up to that, not cut that down to the NEA. So I think it's complicated, and certainly here in Cleveland, you guys have done some interesting work with the county tax at the local level, at the state level. I was down in Columbus just before I came up here and met with the newish executive director of the Ohio State Arts Council, as well as the head of the Ohio Citizens on the Arts. And I'll actually be back for a statewide convening in December, and I'll be more up to speed on sort of public funding issues. So look forward to being back.
You don't know it, but you're the first person who's given me this opportunity. It's amazing.
That's great.
You are in a room that has a unique mural in it. I've never been able to ask a question that ties to the mural, but now I can. What do murals do for neighborhoods?
So I am a little disappointed that the comparison wasn't to the sort of bare-chested, brawny men. But, so what's interesting about that question is that I think there are many different answers. And I'm not as focused on the mural, which I would call the intervention, the activity, the thing that you're doing, as on focusing why it's being done or how it's being deployed. So in many ways, the city that is sort of the godmother, godfather, dean of public murals is Philadelphia. And the woman who runs the mural arts program in Philadelphia is an extraordinary person. And the reason that they do murals and deploy them originally began, not surprisingly, as an anti-graffiti measure, right? There were people who were tagging all sorts of walls and buildings, and they discovered that if you prettied them up, people were less likely to do it because they were like, okay, don't need to tag across that. But what they've discovered over the, I don't know if it's 30 years that Jane Golden's been at this work, what they've discovered is the process of deciding on a mural, where it should go, what the content should be, how it should be created, actually is really important in terms of building community. So that when I was referring to sort of arts maker as a master identity, it turns out that two people who may not have anything in common, if you put them next to each other with a paintbrush and tell them to start going at it at the wall, they'll begin talking, they'll begin finding things they share in common, things they disagree about, and things they start doing that. So a mural can be deployed to prevent graffiti. A mural can be deployed to create community. I've seen murals deployed in ways that help create identities for neighborhoods. One of the things that can be really difficult in a challenged neighborhood is that you're constantly told that your neighborhood is terrible, right? When your neighborhood is talked about, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of poverty, people are so awful there, life is so awful there, it's awful, it's awful, it's awful. And all of a sudden you put up a mural, something that celebrates some piece of the history, some hero from the community, and people start having a positive identity. The two stories that I tend to tell around this identity notion, the first is that when I was working in Mayor Bloomberg's administration, when he was talking about sort of city identity, he said that anywhere he's gone all over the world, anyone can name 2 streets in New York City. And the first is always Wall Street, but the second is always Broadway. So we're a city that's very much tied to that identity. The second story is my predecessor in this job is an extraordinary woman called Carol Coletta, and she was interviewing the then mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Cory Booker, and she asked him what the single hardest thing was about being mayor. What's the most difficult thing about being mayor? And then Mayor Booker thought for a moment and eventually landed on the answer, getting people to believe that tomorrow can be different. So when you think about the power of imagination, when you think about the power of inspiration, when you think of what it means to take a vacant building in St. Cloud Superior and make it the most magical place that you could possibly walk into, a Willy Wonka wonderland of joy and delight, all of a sudden people start saying, oh, maybe it doesn't always have to be vacant. Maybe this doesn't always have to be a challenged neighborhood. Maybe this can be as rich and vibrant as it always has been. So I think there are many, many answers to that question. So thank you very much for it.
And so many of our community development practitioners are watching what's happening in Detroit Shoreway, in Waterloo, in St. Clair Superior. But from the benefit of your wisdom and experience, how would you take a community development practitioner who has been concentrating on, to borrow your phrase, beds and baths, how would you suggest they go beyond and think about the kind of arts and culture to be inculcated in the practice of community development?
Absolutely. So what's so interesting to me, when I was at the NEA, my brief was as communications director. So I was sort of the press flack, the guy who sort of talked about framing. And what was interesting to me in watching how Rocco Landesman approached his job, he originally arrived as chairman of the NEA and said, I'm going to double the size of the budget. And I think it was until about Thursday that he realized that might not happen. So then he began to say, okay, well, let's see what other people are doing. Let's look at what other agencies in the federal government are doing. And he started going around and saying to them, what is it you're trying to do? And let me show you how we can help you do that. And that framework is a very different one. We went to housing and urban development when it was headed up by Sean Donovan. He was talking about the regional sustainable planning they were doing. We didn't go to him and say, you've got $100 million for that little program, throw us a couple bucks. We went to him and said, art and culture can play a really important role in charting the future of a community. Why don't you invite them in alongside the metropolitan planning organizations, community development corporations, and other folks who are applying for that money? So I think similarly, I was lucky enough to meet with the heads of several of Cleveland's CDCs yesterday. And the conversation wasn't about what can you guys do for the arts. It was, what are you trying to do in Central? What are you trying to do in University Circle? What are you trying to do in all these different neighborhoods around Cleveland? And let us show you how we can help you do that. One of the most fascinating projects that we invested in is actually in Austin, Texas. And Austin has had at-large city council representation for almost its entire history as a city, and they're now moving to a district-based system because they discovered that something like 100% of the city council members had come from 2 council districts, so a lot of the city was going unrepresented. So they've redrawn the districts, and they're about to have their first district-based election system. And the city of Austin, the city itself, has hired 10 artists to map those districts, the people who are in them and the assets who are in them. And when those 10 city council members are elected, they're going to be handed an artist project that describes the people and assets that they're now responsible for. So that wasn't someone going to the city and saying, what can you do for the artist? The artist came to the city and said, let us show you how we can help you with this redistricting. So I think that stance as an opening gambit is a really effective one. And anyone who's not an arts person, who's more of a place-based person, cover your ears, it usually ends up meaning more money for the arts in the end. So it's effective doubly. It starts a fundamentally good partnership, and it also ends up loosing more resources for the arts. So I did a brief interview before this, and I was asked, aren't there many sort of creative placemaking skeptics? And I said, our fundamental stance is, what are you doing and how can we help you do it? So not surprisingly, there isn't a lot of resistance when that's the first question. So thank you.
Making. What are the criteria that you most look for in projects that you want to get behind?
So two things. One is, one thing that we try and be clear about is we don't in any way own the concept or the definition of creative placemaking. So what I can tell you is ArtPlace's take on it, just because I think that's important to say, because the National Endowment for the Arts has a creative placemaking funding program, the Kresge Foundation is doing this, the states of Connecticut and California are doing this, and each might have a slightly different take. But for us, it's really those four things I laid out. Define a group of people related by geography, describe a change that group of people would like to see, propose an arts-based intervention, and know when to stop, right? Know when you've succeeded. Have a definition for success that you can measure at that unit of geography. So if the question is about applying to us and succeeding in funding, those are the four things you have to be tall enough to do to get on this ride. But then, how do you distinguish yourself from the other 1,250 applications is really, what is the new idea? What is the new way art and culture is being deployed? What is the new partnership? And then, I'll be very honest, there's a whole host of things that are beyond an individual organization's control. And one of the reasons that I use that Harvard analogy is that when it comes to making a grant decision, yes, we're absolutely funding excellence, but we're also trying to balance a class of grantees that looks like a microcosm of this country. And if you've got two left-handed redheads from Duluth who run track, you may only let one of them in. So you have to do the four fundamentals, you have to do them in a way that distinguishes you, and you have to cross your fingers that there isn't someone else doing the exact same thing. So.
Hi, Jamie. I'm
Jill.
Jill Snyder. Hold on, I'm going to fall off my chair. Thank you. And I direct the Contemporary Art Museum here. I'm a huge fan of ArtPlace and think it's so important for the civic dialogue. And I think anyone who runs a museum knows that it's, ultimately it's strengthening the civic realm. But there is a little bit of a nagging concern that I have, and that is with the success of this dialogue, we are placing emphasis on artists in the service of the civic realm. And I worry a little bit that we are not also validating the role of artists whose work is quiet, contemplative, and not inherently about being extroverted and engaging and meant to be sort of strengthening this kind of infrastructure. And I guess my question to you, do you feel that there is any responsibility on the part of ArtPlace to qualify that or to speak on behalf of art that that is not in, that doesn't claim to make that, those goals?
Yeah, so two answers to that. One is ArtPlace doesn't fund projects that do that. But I think more importantly, the bigger issue is that we do not believe that every artist should be a creative placemaker. We do not believe that every arts organization should be doing creative placemaking. However, we do believe that every city government and every CDC needs to welcome and include artists as members of their community. So not every arts organization, but yes, every place-based organization has to recognize that there are artists among us. And what's hard is that in many ways, ArtPlace is sort of the shiny new toy. So we're the sparkly thing that's getting a lot of attention. And so there is this sort of chasing the money danger of folks saying, oh, all right, well, that's what we got to be doing now, so let's go create a place and go. But if you actually look at the numbers, if you look at the arts funding numbers in this country, there's a publication the NEA does called How the U.S. Funds the Arts, which you can download for free at arts.gov. Public support for arts in this country is, I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, public support for arts in this country is roughly 10%, if you look at the national average, federal, state, and local combined. Foundation and corporate support, foundation support is about another 10 or 12%, which means that the vast majority of arts organizations in this country are being funded by individuals. And I think it's those individuals that are the ones who really recognize the idiosyncratic, the contemplative, the totally bizarre and sits in a corner and I have no idea what it's going to do. I know when I'm investing my Jamie Bennett dollars, there are many things that I invest in that are fundamentally different than when Executive Director Bennett is investing ArtPlace dollars. So I believe we need in this country the entire spectrum of art practice. Michael Rohde, who is one of the founders of Sojourn Theater, talks about a continuum that starts with studio practice, that moves through to social practice, that moves into civic practice, and eventually moves into creative placemaking. And I believe we need to water that entire spectrum. But my day job is funding one piece of it. So, and it's hard because we're sucking up a lot of the media attention, we're sucking up a lot of the arts policy discussion, which, good for me as executive director, but it does potentially have this effect unless there are strong voices on the other side. So outside of my day job, I'm always happy to join you, Jill, and Bill, and all the other great arts leaders to talk about needing that entire rainbow, that entire spectrum, that entire continuum. So thank you.
Hi. Wow, that's loud. I think one of the things that has helped launch creative placemaking as a dialogue and popular strategy is the economic benefit argument, beyond what I think a lot of people in this room would agree is the inherent benefit of creative placemaking. Folks, from Richard Florida onward are arguing for the economic benefits, and I think one of the criticisms that detractors of creative placemaking often cite is the difficulty of obtaining good, solid data on what those benefits are, particularly because creative placemaking sort of feathers out into the community in so many ways. Can you quantify the costs saved by painting a mural in terms of how much graffiti you didn't have to clean up? So my question is, what advice can you offer for those who might be gathering this sort of data? Mm-hmm. What can we do to encourage more people to gather this type of data? And to the kind of philosophical, do you think that there is a danger in always kind of returning to this economic development argument in favor of a sort of more intrinsic argument for creative placemaking?
Okay, that's about 4 different questions. So 3 different questions. Let me see if I can do them all. One of the things which I'm fascinated by, because this happens every time I speak, I think I'm an okay writer, I think I'm an okay speaker, and I created a set of remarks that talked about the arts as being a fundamental part of community development, about driving foot traffic, about driving social cohesion, about increasing civic engagement, about doing a number of things. And what everyone hears when I go through that litany is, oh, you're talking about economic development. So just one thing to underscore is that, yes, I'm talking about economic development, but I'm talking about that as one subset of community planning and development. So just to be clear, we don't just care about economic development. It is an important part of community development, but it's not the only thing. Data doesn't have to be that hard. Some of it is, and some of it isn't. And what I think is really useful, one of the reasons that we talk about being prepared to recognize success rather than using the language of outcomes and evaluations, is that people sort of freeze up when you talk about outcomes and evaluations, and it's a scary thing that you don't understand. And really, we're talking about you're setting out to do something. How do you know if you're going to do that? So one of the people I had this conversation with was Oscar Eustis, who runs a public theater in New York. And when you talk about the public theater's mission, one of the ways you can talk about it is adding new voices to the canon of American theater. What are some voices that haven't been represented in the canon of theater? And that's their job, to bring these new voices into the mainstream. So is counting ticket sales a good way to do that? No. It's an easy way, but it doesn't actually tell you anything. It turns out that if a play has a New York production and 2 regional productions within an 18-month period, that's a pretty good indicator that it's entered the canon. Regional theaters will start producing it, it'll start entering monologue books. So what I think the public theater should be counting is how many of their plays have 2 regional productions within 18 months after their New York production. And their seasons may be 10 plays. So we're talking about collecting 20 data points, but they're the ones that are relevant and focused. You can go more macro. The researchers that I laid out, Mark Stern and Susan Seifert at the University of Pennsylvania, Ann Markison at the University of Minnesota, Alika Wally at the Field Museum, Joan Jeffrey, who's now at the Center for Creative Aging, they've all done some larger, more based in social science mapping of social networks, and we can do that. And then the last piece, which is actually something that's become a favorite thing that I've been thinking about and may want to give a big speech on at some point, is this intrinsic instrumental divide that you sketched out. And for anyone who doesn't follow wonky arts policy, the Wallace Foundation worked with Rand, I don't know if it was a decade ago, 2 decades ago, and did a piece of research that resulted in a report called Gifts of the Muse. And it laid out this difference of intrinsic benefits of the arts, the inspirational, the provocative, the deeply personal, and instrumental benefits, foot traffic, economic development, and all of that. And what I think I've decided, I'm not sure of this, but I'll try it out. What I think I've decided is that that is maybe a dichotomy that has outlived its purpose. Because I don't know that that dichotomy makes sense in isolation. Because I believe that all the things that the arts do all happen when art happens, and some of them may or may not be more relevant to the conversation at hand. So rather than this intrinsic instrumental dichotomy, I'm much more interested in something like the 7 blind men and the elephant. And if we're having a conversation that requires an ear, I have an ear. If we're having one that requires a tail, I have a tail. If we have one that requires a leg, we'll have a leg. The recent example of how this played out is we were meeting with one of the guys from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, the guy who runs the community development arm of that. And we're having a conversation because they're going to do a journal issue on creative placemaking in the new year, which is very exciting. And he asked me to talk about the benefits for the arts. And because I've spent 2 decades working in nonprofit arts, I began with my good old instrumental benefit. And I said, the arts are really about driving empathy, and you present the other on stage, and you see it framed in narrative, and you're able to bridge your differences and become bonded with the other. And I just watched as his eyes sort of rolled up in his head. And I panicked, and so I grabbed out to Stern and Seifert, and I said, well, no, by empathy, when you're driving empathy, which is an intrinsic benefit of the arts, you're also driving social cohesion and civic engagement, and you're driving more stable communities. And it was actually Ian who said, what you're really talking about is changing tenant turnover rates. That the result of a stable community to a housing developer is lower tenant turnover rates. So that's not more or less valid, it's just more or less relevant. So thank you, and I think I've now gone on too long.
Today at the City Club, we've been listening to a forum featuring Jamie Bennett, Executive Director at ArtPlace America. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The forum is now adjourned.